This is Kristen Cayley with a video podcast on working with and lobbying California state agencies. An important but often overlooked component of lobbying in California is the lobbying for or against regulations being promulgated by state agencies or departments. There are both fiscal and policy state agencies that also influence legislation traveling through the legislative process, as well as when a bill reaches the governor's desk. So the administrative agencies of California state government can play very important roles in public policy development in this state, both as it relates to pending legislation that's being considered by the California Legislature, ultimately with the governor's determination, but there's also opportunities with the role that they play in administrative rulemaking. So the first set is the role that they play in pending legislation. For example, the California Air Resources Board is going to weigh in on air quality related legislation with the governor's office, with interest groups, members of the legislature, etc. Because they're part of the executive branch of state government, these different state agencies, departments, boards, commissions, they're generally accountable if line agencies to the governor. As a result, they're going to play an important role in advising the governor and the governor's staff on pending legislation. So if you're involved in advocating for or against legislation and legislative advocacy, you've got to engage with these administrative entities, often early in the legislative process. First, to make sure that the agencies are aware of your client's position on the legislation, but also to solicit, at least informally, the state agency's views on the particular legislation. Because of their ability to provide valuable input to the governor, as well as legislators and interest groups, you've got to be aware of what their agencies are considering in terms of possible positions or amendments to proposals, and just to solicit the pros and cons that they view on a particular legislative effort. The recommendations of the state administrative agencies, just like their federal counterparts in the US government, carry a great deal of weight with the chief executive and the staff in California of the governor. And particularly when it comes to the final actions to be taken by the governor, that is to sign or veto legislation. In addition to the views that these state agencies have on the subject matter under their jurisdiction, every measure that has a fiscal impact is considered and analyzed, of course, by the Department of Finance. And DOF, for bills that reach the governor's desk, they're going to make a recommendation to either sign or veto that bill. Sometimes they might be neutral. Particularly though, if the bill is going to have an impact on the fiscal condition of the state, you can expect their recommendation probably to veto it if it's unaccounted for. And it's not too often that a veto or that a governor acts differently than the Department of Finance does in terms of their recommendation. So if you look back historically, whether the governor is a Democrat or a Republican, the Department of Finance generally appears to have tremendous sway over the final outcome of legislation reaching the governor's desk. So long before your bill reaches the governor's desk, I think any good lobbyist is going to try and get a read on both how the governor might view it through the eyes of the governor's legislative unit deputies, but also what the view of the Department of Finance may be. And so, you've got to sit down with them and advise them of your client's view of things, but also to get their take. These agencies and departments, as well as the boards and commissions, provide both informal and formal advice. And of course, informally, they can communicate with the governor's office by in-person conversations or emails or texts. And their formal advice comes through their written analyses and usually with an accompanying recommendation for an official position. Now, these written analyses are first sent to the agency which oversees the department or the board or commission or council for approval of that analysis and whether they agree or disagree with the recommended position. And then the agency forwards that analysis to the governor's legislative unit and the deputy legislative secretary who has jurisdiction or that portfolio is then going to decide whether or not to approve the recommended position. It's upon this written approval of the governor's office whether the agency analysis or the Department of Finance analysis gets released. So does the department or the DOF have a public position? That's whether or not it's been approved by the governor's office. And in those cases, the bill author's office gets a copy of the approved analysis. And actually, once approved, the Department of Finance posts its fiscal analyses on its website for public viewing. So again, it's important for you to recognize these executive branch agencies and departments and their analyses that they provide. And I think it's a generally good practice to share your client's support or opposition letters with both the Department of Finance and the relevant agency or department so that they have that information as they're preparing their own internal analyses. And then once their official position is made public, then you can obviously determine whether or not your client's position has had any impact on their particular analysis or their recommended position. Ultimately, these agencies and departments, as well as the Department of Finance, prepare EBRs for all the bills that are enrolled and presented to the governor. That is, those that reach the governor's desk. EBRs are not prepared for constitutional amendments and resolutions because these types of legislative measures are not sent to the governor for ultimate approval. So, while the DOF focus is primarily fiscal in nature, they do raise policy concerns with the bill from time to time. So you have to be aware of that fact too, that DOF is not focused exclusively on the fiscal aspect. Some of these analyses are just a few pages. Others are very detailed. Some identify implementation concerns or raise other issues. So they're generally shorter in explanation and focus on a department's or the DOF's or an agency's specific concerns or their views on the particular measure at hand.